When someone says, "What's yours is mine," does it go both ways? My husband Ethan made six figures at his family's nursing home chain, but shared none of it. I worked at a homeless shelter for minimum wage while he bought Rolexes and made me beg for grocery money. I had to ask permission to buy tampons, and he'd make me wait until next month if he thought I was using too many. When I needed $20 for my sister's birthday dinner, he made me promise to only order water and a salad. "You're too emotional to handle money, which is why you chose a bleeding heart career instead of something profitable," he'd say while spending more on one dinner than I made in a month. He monitored all my texts and emails and said his family's lawyers would destroy me if I tried to leave. He told me they'd make sure I ended up homeless like the people I wasted my life helping. When I got pregnant, I cried because I'd always wanted to be a mother and because I was terrified of how Ethan would react. He calculated how much the baby would cost and scheduled an abortion for the next week. I begged him to let me keep it, but he said I'd proven I couldn't even manage grocery money, so how could I manage a child? He made me pay him back for half the procedure from my food budget, while I cried myself to sleep every night for months. The worst part was how he'd bring it up whenever I asked for anything, like I owed him for saving me from ruining my life with a baby. But then federal investigators showed up at his family's nursing homes with warrants and camera crews. They'd been billing Medicare for dead residents and drugging elderly people who complained about abuse. Ethan's father and uncle got arrested on live television, while law enforcement froze all their assets, including our bank accounts. Ethan came home screaming that I needed to find a real job immediately to support us through this temporary setback. But then something amazing happened. My shelter got a massive federal grant and offered me the director position because I was the only one with the right degree. The salary was triple what I'd ever made, while Ethan now had nothing after lawyers took everything. We moved into a tiny apartment near my work because he couldn't afford his BMW anymore. Suddenly, he was the sweetest husband in the world, making my coffee and packing my lunch with little love notes. He wrote out a budget for my salary showing how we could live comfortably if I let him manage the money again. "We're a team, and teams share everything equally," he said while trying to get my bank password. I opened my own account and changed my direct deposit without telling him. When he found out, he cried actual tears, saying marriage meant sharing everything. "You financially abused me for 5 years and made me beg for tampon money," I said while he followed me around the apartment. He swore he'd changed and that losing everything taught him what really mattered. But I knew he just wanted access to my money because no one would hire him with his name all over the news. He started love-bombing me with flowers from the park and elaborate dinners from groceries bought with food stamps. I filed for divorce thinking I'd finally be free from him. Ethan laughed, saying his prenup meant I'd get nothing from the marriage. The problem was, he had nothing left to protect while I was now making good money. My lawyer explained that since I'd been supporting him, I'd have to keep paying him alimony. Ethan showed up to mediation in his last designer suit with a lawyer he'd paid using his mother's jewelry. He argued that he'd supported me for years, so now it was my turn to support him forever. The mediator suggested we split things evenly, but Ethan wanted more than half of everything. He said he was traumatized by his family's crimes and needed my financial support to heal from the trauma. My lawyer told me to stay quiet even though I wanted to scream at his lies. I sat there realizing I'd escaped his abuse just to become financially responsible for supporting my abuser. Ethan smiled at me the same way he used to when denying me money for groceries. "What's yours is mine, baby, just like when I had the money and you had nothing." His lawyer kept pushing for maximum support, saying Ethan deserved to maintain his lifestyle. They wanted most of my salary, plus health insurance and retirement funds. Ethan fake cried about how I was abandoning him when he needed me most. He said I was heartless for leaving him during the worst time of his life. The mediator actually seemed to feel sorry for him, which made me sick to my stomach. I finally stood up to leave because I couldn't listen to him playing victim anymore. Ethan grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises and pulled me back down. His lawyer pretended not to see while mine was busy with her phone. I yanked my arm away and headed for the door, but Ethan followed me into the hallway, still gripping my arm. "I wonder how your religious shelter board would feel about their new director being a baby killer," he said with that same smile from our wedding day. "All those Catholic donors finding out you had an abortion because a baby would inconvenience your career." He pulled out his phone and showed me an email draft addressed to every board member with my medical records attached. "Give me everything I want, or I hit send right now, and you lose the only job you've ever been proud of." I stood there frozen in that hallway, staring at his phone screen, with my medical records attached to an email draft addressed to every single board member. The abortion I'd paid him back for from my food budget was now his weapon to destroy the only good thing in my life. My arm throbbed where he'd grabbed me, and I could already feel the bruises forming under my sleeve. His finger hovered over the send button while he watched my face with that same satisfied look from when he used to deny me grocery money. My hands started shaking as I pulled out my own phone and held it up like I was checking a message. I angled it toward his screen and started taking photos as fast as I could while he was still gloating about his plan. He was too busy enjoying my fear to notice what I was doing with my phone. The camera captured the email draft, clearly showing my medical records and all the board members' email addresses lined up in the recipient field. He kept talking about how I'd ruined his life, and now it was his turn to ruin mine. I took 3 more photos, making sure I got everything, including his hand holding the phone. Without saying anything, I turned and walked away from him toward the elevator. "You have 48 hours to agree to my terms or I hit send," he called after me down the hallway. My lawyer Greta was still in the mediation room gathering her papers, completely unaware of what had just happened out here. I kept walking without looking back, even though every part of me wanted to run. The elevator took forever to arrive, and I could feel him watching me from the hallway. When the doors finally opened, I got in and pressed the button for the parking garage. My legs were shaking. So bad I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. In my car, I locked the doors and pulled up the photos I'd taken on my phone. They showed everything clearly, including the email draft with my medical records and every board member's email address. My wrist was already turning purple where he'd grabbed me, and I knew I needed to document this too. I rolled up my sleeve and took photos of the bruises forming in the shape of his fingers. The marks were getting darker by the minute, and I took photos from different angles to show everything. I started my car and drove straight to the urgent care clinic near the courthouse. At the desk, I told them my ex-husband had hurt me during a legal meeting. The nurse brought me back immediately and asked me to show her what happened. She took photos of the bruises on my wrist with their camera and wrote down everything I told her. She gave me paperwork that documented the injury as assault-related and said I could use it for legal purposes. Another nurse came in and examined my wrist to make sure nothing was broken. They gave me an ice pack and told me to follow up if the pain got worse. From the urgent care parking lot, I called Greta and told her everything about the blackmail threat and the assault. She went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. "We need to file for a restraining order immediately and document the extortion attempt," she said. I sent her the photos I'd taken of his phone screen and the bruises on my wrist. She told me to forward the urgent care paperwork too, and she'd start preparing the filing right away. Greta explained that blackmail is technically a crime, but prosecution is rare and slow. She said with medical records, he could claim he got them during our marriage, which made things complicated. Our immediate priority was protecting my job and safety while we built a stronger case. She told me to save everything, including any texts or voicemails he might send. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept checking my email every few minutes to see if he'd sent anything to the board yet. Every notification on my phone made my heart race, thinking it might be someone from work asking about the email. I realized I needed help beyond just legal advice because I didn't know how to handle this kind of threat. I searched online for domestic violence resources and found websites with safety planning guides. The information talked about how leaving is often when abusers get most dangerous. I read story after story from women who'd been through similar situations with their ex-husbands. Some had lost their jobs, and others had fought back and won, but it took years. The next morning, I called a domestic violence hotline and explained my situation to the counselor who answered. She walked me through creating a safety plan, including changing my routines and documenting everything. She said Ethan's escalation from financial abuse to physical assault and blackmail was a common pattern. The counselor explained that I needed to take his threats seriously because abusers often follow through when they feel they're losing control. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay and people who could support me. I told her about my sister, but explained I didn't want to put her in danger. The counselor said she was connecting me with someone local who could help me navigate the legal system. She gave me the name Nora Schaffer, who specialized in helping abuse survivors deal with complicated situations like mine. Nora agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop near the shelter where I worked. She showed up 10 minutes early with a yellow legal pad and a folder full of forms that she spread across the small table between our coffees. Nora pulled out a pen and started writing the date at the top of the page while asking me to start from the beginning with the first time Ethan controlled money in our relationship. I told her about the tampon money, and she wrote down every detail, including dates and amounts, while shaking her head. She asked about grocery money, and I explained how I had to show receipts and return change after every shopping trip. Her pen moved fast across the paper as I described the $20 limit for my sister's birthday dinner and how he made me promise to only order water. She flipped to a new page when I got to the pregnancy and abortion, writing down how much I had to pay him back from my food budget. I showed her the photos from my phone of his email draft with my medical records, and she took pictures of them with her own phone for backup. She measured the bruises on my wrist with a small ruler from her bag and wrote down the exact size and color. We went through every text message he'd sent since I filed for divorce, and she helped me organize them by date in a special app that saves everything with timestamps. She explained that judges need to see patterns of behavior, not just single incidents, so documentation was everything. After 2 hours, we had 15 pages of notes covering 5 years of financial abuse, plus the recent physical assault and blackmail. She gave me a small notebook to carry everywhere and write down anything new that happened with dates and times. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about everything we'd documented and realized I needed to protect my job before Ethan followed through on his threat. The next morning, I called Sharon McLean's assistant and asked for an urgent meeting about a sensitive personal matter. My voice shook when I explained it was about something that could affect the shelter's reputation. Sharon's assistant scheduled me for that afternoon, and I spent the morning practicing what I would say. I printed out the photos of Ethan's blackmail threat and put them in a folder along with the restraining order paperwork Greta was preparing. Walking into Sharon's office felt like walking to my own execution because I didn't know how she would react. Sharon closed the door and sat across from me at her small conference table instead of behind her desk. I started crying before I could even speak, and she handed me a tissue box while waiting patiently. I explained that my ex-husband was threatening to send my private medical information to the board to destroy my career. She asked what kind of medical information, and I told her about the abortion from years ago, when Ethan controlled everything. Sharon took notes while I explained the financial abuse and how he was now demanding alimony while also blackmailing me. She looked at the photos of his email draft and asked if I felt safe. I told her about the restraining order Greta was filing and the bruises on my wrist from the mediation meeting. Sharon said she would personally handle any communication from Ethan that came to board members and asked me to forward everything immediately. She reminded me that many women have had abortions and that my personal medical history had nothing to do with my ability to run the shelter. She said the board hired me for my skills and dedication, not my personal life, and that she would make sure the other members understood that. I left her office feeling lighter but still worried about what Ethan might do next. Back at my desk, I found Kurt Wu from IT waiting with his laptop and a concerned look on his face. He said Sharon had called him and asked him to help me secure all my digital accounts immediately. We spent 3 hours going through every email account, social media profile, and online service I'd ever used. Kurt found 7 attempted logins to my work email from an IP address that matched our old apartment building. He showed me how someone had tried to reset my password 12 times in the past week. We changed every password to random combinations of letters and numbers that Kurt wrote down in a special encrypted file. He set up 2-factor authentication on everything, so I'd get a text message anytime someone tried to log in. Kurt discovered that Ethan had installed tracking software on my personal laptop months ago that was sending him copies of everything I typed. We wiped the laptop completely and started fresh with new security software that Kurt said would block any attempts to spy on me. He gave me a special USB drive that would automatically check any computer I used for tracking software. Meanwhile, Greta was at the courthouse filing for a temporary restraining order with all the evidence we'd collected. She called to say the judge wanted to see us tomorrow for an emergency hearing based on the physical assault and blackmail threats. That evening, Ethan started sending texts that switched between saying he loved me and wanted to work things out to calling me selfish for destroying his life. One message said we were meant to be together, and the next said I was heartless for abandoning him when his family was in crisis. I screenshot each message and forwarded them to Greta without responding, even though I wanted to tell him to leave me alone. He sent 15 texts in 2 hours, then switched to calling and leaving voicemails that got increasingly angry. His final voicemail that night said I had 24 hours left to accept his settlement offer, or he would make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. 3 days passed and he still hadn't sent the email to the board, but I checked my phone constantly expecting to see it. Nora called to check on me and explained that this was typical behavior for abusers who use threats to maintain control. She said he was waiting to see if I would cave to his demands, because actually following through would mean losing his leverage over me. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the next morning, and I spent hours organizing everything into a binder with labeled tabs. Greta said preparation was crucial because we'd only have 15 minutes to present our case to the judge. I printed every text message, organized the photos by date, and made copies of the urgent care records showing my bruised wrist. That evening, my phone rang from an unknown number, and when I answered, a man introduced himself as Micah Blair from the Tribune. He said he was covering the nursing home scandal and wanted to ask about my connection to the family. I started to hang up, but he quickly said he wasn't looking for a quote, just background information about the family dynamics. We ended up talking for an hour off the record about financial abuse in wealthy families and how it stays hidden. Micah told me his investigation found 3 former nurses who faced similar threats when they tried to report the Medicare fraud years ago. Each one got letters threatening to expose personal information or destroy their careers if they went to authorities. The family's lawyers had a whole system for digging up dirt on employees and using it against them. One nurse had her DUI from college sent to every hospital in the state when she tried to file a complaint. Another had photos from her divorce leaked to her new workplace after she talked to investigators. Micah showed me copies of the threatening letters, and they all had the same tone as Ethan's threats to me. He said the FBI was now looking into these patterns as part of the larger case, but it would take months before anything happened. The next morning at work, I noticed people whispering and looking at me weird in the hallway. My assistant pulled me aside and said someone saw Ethan sitting in his car in the parking lot yesterday afternoon just watching the building. Security checked the cameras and confirmed he'd been there for 3 hours before they noticed and asked him to leave. Sharon called me into her office and suggested I work from home for a few days while they figured out better security measures. She arranged for a guard to walk me to my car, and I saw 2 other staff members watching from the windows. The restraining order hearing was set for that Friday, and I spent the whole week organizing my evidence binder. When we got to court, Ethan showed up with his lawyer, who immediately started arguing that divorce proceedings required communication between parties. The judge looked through my photos of the bruises and the screenshots of the blackmail threat, while Ethan's lawyer kept talking about how this was just a misunderstanding. She asked Ethan directly if he'd grabbed me, and he said we were just having an emotional conversation about our marriage. The judge wasn't buying it, and granted a temporary restraining order, but with specific provisions about the divorce proceedings. The order said no direct contact except through lawyers, and he had to stay 500 feet away from me and my workplace. Within 2 hours of leaving court, my sister called crying because Ethan's mother had just called her. His mother said I was being cruel to her son during the worst time of his life, and that I should be supporting him through his family's crisis. My sister hung up on her, but then got 3 more calls from different numbers, all from Ethan's relatives. The financial hearing 2 weeks later was even worse than I expected. Ethan's lawyer argued he couldn't work because of trauma from his family's arrests and the public shame. They brought a therapist who testified that Ethan was suffering from severe depression and anxiety that made employment impossible. My lawyer pointed out that he seemed fine enough to stalk me at work, but the judge said mental health issues were complex. The judge set temporary support at $2,800 a month, which was almost half my take-home pay. I sat there doing math in my head, realizing I'd have to move to an even smaller apartment. Sharon arranged emergency meetings with our biggest donors to get ahead of any potential scandal. She explained that I was going through a difficult divorce, but the shelter fully supported me and trusted my leadership. The first donor, an older woman who'd been supporting us for years, said she understood and doubled her donation. The second donor, a conservative businessman, expressed concerns about the shelter's reputation, and said he needed to think about his continued support. Sharon spent an hour reassuring him, but I could tell he was already planning to pull his funding. 3 nights later, I was coming home from the grocery store when I saw Ethan standing across the street from my apartment building. He was technically 501 feet away, according to the measuring app on his phone that he held up and waved at me. I called the police, but they said since he wasn't violating the exact distance requirement, there was nothing they could do. The officer suggested I go inside quickly and document everything, which I did while watching Ethan pace back and forth for another hour. That night, I woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing and couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I called Nora, who talked me through breathing exercises and then connected me with a trauma therapist who specialized in domestic abuse survivors. The therapist got me in for an emergency session the next day and explained that my body was responding to ongoing threat and hypervigilance. She said panic attacks were normal for people in my situation and taught me grounding techniques to use when I felt overwhelmed. Meanwhile, Greta discovered something disturbing when reviewing my work email security logs. Kurt from IT had been monitoring my accounts and found 12 password reset attempts from an IP address in the public library near Ethan's apartment. The attempts happened at different times over the past week, always failing because of the 2-factor authentication Kurt had set up. Kurt pulled the complete server logs showing the exact times and locations of each attempt, which we added to our growing evidence file. 2 weeks into the restraining order, Ethan's lawyer sent Greta a settlement proposal that made my stomach turn. They wanted me to pay $3,600 a month in alimony for 3 years and sign a comprehensive NDA about everything. In exchange, Ethan would destroy the medical records and stop all contact attempts. Greta read it to me over the phone and said it was extortion with extra steps, but wrapped in legal language to make it look legitimate. I told Greta there was no way I'd agree to paying him that much money just to keep him quiet about something that wasn't even illegal. She called the police station right away and scheduled an appointment with a detective who handled extortion cases. The next morning, I sat in a small gray room at the station while the detective typed up my statement and looked at all the photos I'd taken of Ethan's phone screen. He leaned back in his chair and explained that cases like mine rarely went anywhere because prosecutors needed rock-solid proof, and my ex could claim he got those records during our marriage. I left the station feeling like the system wouldn't help me, but at least there was now an official record of what Ethan was doing. That afternoon, Micah called asking if I'd seen his new article about financial abuse during divorce proceedings. I pulled it up on my computer and my hands started shaking as I read descriptions that matched my situation almost exactly, even though he didn't use any names. Within hours, the article had thousands of shares and my inbox filled with messages from women telling me their own stories about paying alimony to abusive exes. Some had been through worse than me, and reading their experiences made me feel less alone in this nightmare. 2 weeks later, we had another mediation session scheduled, and I slipped my phone into my pocket with the voice recorder app already running. Ethan sat across from me doing that fake, concerned face while his lawyer talked about reasonable settlements and moving forward. Then Ethan leaned forward and said he still had those medical records ready to send if I didn't cooperate with his terms. His lawyer quickly tried to change the subject, but I'd gotten what I needed on the recording. Greta listened to it afterwards and said it might not work in court since recording laws were complicated, but it could help with the criminal charges. I brought the recording to the detective, who said he'd send it to the district attorney's office for review. He sat me down and explained that I shouldn't expect much because these cases moved slowly, and prosecutors had bigger crimes to worry about. He suggested I focus on protecting myself through the civil courts and document everything Ethan did from now on. Sharon called me into her office the next week and closed the door behind us. She explained that the board had voted to support me, but they wanted to see specific performance goals met to keep their confidence in my leadership. I'd need to increase donor engagement by 20% and maintain current service levels while dealing with all this personal chaos. My job was safe for now, but I could feel everyone watching me more closely than before. 3 days later, Kurt knocked on my office door looking worried. He'd been monitoring our donor database when he noticed an anonymous email sent to our biggest supporters with weird comments about the shelter's leadership making questionable moral choices. Kurt traced the IP address through the email headers and found it came from a public library computer right near where Ethan lived. We printed everything and added it to the growing pile of restraining order violations. The contempt hearing happened 2 weeks later in a courtroom that smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. The judge reviewed the evidence about the donor email and looked annoyed but not surprised. She fined Ethan $500 and warned that next time would mean jail, but I could tell from her tone she'd said this to lots of people who never actually went to jail. I sat there watching Ethan smirk because he knew the fine meant nothing, and he'd just be more careful next time. My therapist's office had those generic beach paintings that were supposed to be calming, but I spent most sessions staring at the carpet instead. She helped me understand that what hurt most wasn't just the abortion itself, but how Ethan turned my grief into a weapon against me. She reminded me that millions of women have abortions for all kinds of reasons, and his attempt to shame me showed his character, not mine. We worked through breathing exercises for when the panic attacks hit, and she taught me to recognize the physical signs before they got bad. After 3 months of back and forth with lawyers and court dates and violations, we finally got to a settlement conference. Greta spent 6 hours in that conference room fighting for me while I sat in the hallway checking my phone every 2 minutes. She came out looking tired but said we'd reached a deal for 18 months of reduced alimony with strict enforcement of the restraining order. It wasn't perfect, but it meant I'd only be paying him half of what he originally wanted, and there would be real consequences if he contacted me again. The judge reviewed our agreement and extended the restraining order for 6 more months with specific language about digital harassment and third-party contact. She made it clear that any emails to donors or board members would count as violations, even if Ethan used fake accounts or had someone else send them. The order also covered social media and any attempt to damage my professional reputation through online posts or anonymous messages. I walked out of that courthouse knowing I had some protection, but also understanding that piece of paper wouldn't actually stop Ethan from trying to hurt me if he really wanted to. 2 days later, Kurt burst into my office holding his laptop and showing me an email that had just gone out to our entire donor list from something called Concerned Citizen 847, with the subject line, "Questions about your shelter leadership." The email didn't mention the abortion directly, but said the shelter director had serious moral failings and a troubled personal history that donors deserve to know about, with links to articles about Ethan's family crimes and hints that I was somehow involved. Kurt traced the IP address to the public library 3 blocks from Ethan's apartment, and we printed everything while Sharon started calling major donors to do damage control. She spent hours on the phone explaining that a disgruntled ex was trying to harm the shelter to hurt me. But by the end of the day, our biggest donor, a Catholic charity that gave us $40,000 a year, pulled their funding saying they couldn't risk being associated with controversy. The next morning, I stood in front of our entire staff in the conference room with my hands shaking behind the podium. I told them someone from my personal life was trying to damage the shelter because of a difficult divorce I was going through, and that I understood if anyone had concerns about my ability to lead during this time. The room stayed quiet for a moment before our oldest caseworker stood up and said she'd been through her own messy divorce and knew how men could weaponize anything to maintain control. One by one, other staff members shared their own stories or just nodded in support, and our maintenance guy said anyone who messed with our director messed with all of them. 2 weeks later, we were back in court for another contempt hearing after I documented the donor email as a restraining order violation. The judge looked tired as she reviewed the evidence, fined Ethan another $1,000 he didn't have, and ordered 40 hours of community service at a soup kitchen, which felt like a joke since he'd spend that time probably planning his next attack. Walking out of the courthouse, I finally understood that the legal system wasn't going to save me, and I needed to start protecting myself in other ways. I spent the next weekend looking at apartments and buildings with doormen and security cameras, eventually finding a place that cost $300 more a month, but had a front desk staffed 24 hours and required keycards for the elevator. The doorman was a retired cop named Frank, who took one look at my restraining order paperwork and promised to memorize Ethan's photo and call police if he ever showed up. Moving my stuff took 2 trips in a rental van with Sharon and Nora helping, and we changed my address with the post office using their confidential victim program, so Ethan couldn't track where I lived. 3 months after that hallway confrontation, Greta called to say we'd reached a final divorce settlement with 18 months of reduced alimony at $800 a month instead of the $2,000 Ethan originally wanted, plus strict enforcement of the restraining order with criminal penalties for any violation. I sat in her office signing paper after paper, writing my name next to spots marked with yellow sticky notes, feeling both relief that it was ending and rage that I'd be sending checks to my abuser for the next year and a half. The next week, Sharon called me into her office where 3 board members sat around her conference table looking serious. They offered to renew my contract, but with quarterly performance reviews to ensure stability during this transitional period, which meant they'd be watching everything I did and could fire me if Ethan caused more donor problems. I accepted because I needed the job and knew I'd proven myself before and could do it again, even with them breathing down my neck. Nora suggested I join a support group she knew about that met Tuesday nights in a church basement, and at first I resisted because I didn't want to sit around talking about feelings with strangers. But I went anyway, and found 12 other women who understood exactly what I was going through, including 3 who were also paying alimony to their abusers because they'd been the higher earners when they finally escaped. One woman had been paying her ex for 3 years while he lived with his girlfriend, and another's ex had gotten half her retirement even though he'd gambled away their savings, and hearing their stories made me feel less alone and less crazy for being angry about the unfairness of it all. 6 months after that hallway confrontation where Ethan grabbed my wrist and threatened me with those medical records, I was seeing my therapist twice a week and had managed to save $3,000 in an emergency fund that Ethan couldn't touch. My body stayed on high alert with every unexpected sound making me jump, and every unknown number on my phone making my chest tight, but I was learning to breathe through the panic and remind myself that I'd survived worse and could handle whatever came next. Micah called one afternoon to follow up on the nursing home story and mentioned that Ethan's father had just taken a plea deal that included 4 years in federal prison for Medicare fraud. He said Ethan's name kept appearing in every article about the family's crimes, making him basically unemployable in any legitimate business, which explained why he'd gotten more desperate about the alimony money lately. After we talked, I spent the entire weekend at my bank and on the phone with credit agencies, freezing my credit. So no one could open accounts in my name, closing every joint account we'd ever had, including old store cards I'd forgotten about, and setting up a whole new financial system with different banks and passwords Ethan had never known. I created spreadsheets tracking every penny coming in and going out, set up automatic transfers to savings the day after each paycheck hit, and for the first time since I was 22 years old, had complete control over my own money without anyone monitoring or questioning or making me beg for basic necessities. The first alimony check felt like writing a ransom payment to my own kidnapper, but I taped a countdown calendar to my fridge with 18 red X marks to cross off. Every month, I'd transfer the money, then immediately move the rest into savings accounts he couldn't touch, while tracking every penny in color-coded spreadsheets. I bought a cheap notebook and started writing down everything that happened during our marriage, including dates and details I'd forgotten. 3 months into paying him, Ethan's lawyer sent a letter claiming he needed more money for mental health treatment after the trauma of his family's crimes. Greta called me within minutes of getting the letter and told me not to worry because she had 12 documented restraining order violations ready to file. She faxed back 3 pages of police reports and court records showing every time Ethan had broken the no-contact order. The lawyer never responded, and we heard nothing for weeks until Ethan showed up at my office parking garage despite the restraining order. Security called the police while I sat in my locked car watching him pace around looking for me. 8 months after that horrible hallway confrontation, Sharon called me into her office with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. The board had voted to promote me to regional director overseeing our 3 city shelters with a 40% raise. I signed the paperwork with shaking hands, then went to the bathroom and cried happy tears for 10 minutes. The new job meant traveling between shelters and managing triple the staff, but I threw myself into the work. My therapist's office became my second home as we worked through panic attacks that hit at random times. Nora introduced me to a friend of hers who ran self-defense classes, and I started going twice a week. Learning to throw a punch made me feel stronger, even though my hands shook for hours after each class. A year after everything started, I met someone at a charity fundraiser who made me laugh for the first time in months. He asked about my work and actually listened when I talked about the shelters and our programs. When I mentioned needing separate bank accounts on our 3rd date, he just nodded and said that made sense. He never pushed for details about my past, or questioned why certain topics made me go quiet. My sister started coming over every Sunday for dinner, and we'd cook together while she told me work stories. One night, she grabbed my hand and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything with Ethan. She said watching me stand up to him taught her to never let anyone control her money or her choices. We started a tradition where she'd come with me to deposit the alimony check, then we'd get ice cream after. 14 months into the payments, I started putting together a guide about financial abuse based on everything I'd learned. Nora helped me organize it into sections about recognizing warning signs and creating escape plans with resource lists. We printed 500 copies and distributed them through domestic violence networks and women's shelters across 3 states. The countdown calendar got shorter, and I started planning what I'd do when the payments finally ended. Month 17 arrived with another letter from Ethan's lawyer asking for an extension, but Greta shut it down immediately. She filed a motion showing his continued harassment, and the judge denied his request without even scheduling a hearing. The final payment came on a Tuesday morning, and I wrote the check while my sister filmed me dropping it in the mail. That afternoon, I wrote another check for the exact same amount to the domestic violence shelter downtown. The donation receipt went into a frame that I hung next to my diploma in my new corner office. 2 years from that hallway where Ethan grabbed my wrist and threatened to destroy my career, everything had changed completely. I was running 3 shelters with a staff of 42 people and a budget I never could have imagined. My boyfriend understood why I flinched at sudden movements and never complained when I needed space to breathe. The nightmares still came sometimes, and I'd wake up checking my phone for threatening emails that never arrived. My emergency fund had grown to 6 months of expenses, and I had 3 different bank accounts at 3 different banks. Every financial decision was mine alone, and I never had to ask permission or explain myself to anyone. The scars on my wrist from where Ethan grabbed me had faded to thin white lines barely visible anymore. But the strength I'd found through surviving him grew stronger every single day as I helped other women escape. My guide had been reprinted 4 times, and Nora said women called weekly, saying it had saved their lives. I kept a folder of thank you letters from women who'd used the guide to leave their abusers safely. That's the whole story. Thanks for sticking around through all that. Subscribe if you want more, or not, your choice.